Welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio, exploring the frontiers of spirituality, consciousness, the esoteric, and humanity's sacred relationship with the living earth. Greetings. I'm your host, Nick Mather, and in this episode, I speak with Lee Adams, author of A Visionary Guide to Lucid Dreaming. In our conversation, not only do Lee and I discuss lucid dreaming, but we also talk about dialoguing with your dreams, symbolism and synchronicity, shamanism and shadow work, and the phenomena of sleep paralysis. At one point, you will also hear a very disgruntled kitty in the background protesting his unjust imprisonment inside the house. Sorry about that. I'm joined today by Lee Adams, author of the recently released book, A Visionary Guide to Lucid Dreaming. Lee has been actively researching, practicing, and teaching lucid dreaming for over 20 years. He is also the host of the Cosmic Echo podcast and is a sleep and dream coach. Lee has a BA in psychology and is currently pursuing a doctoral degree at the Pacific Graduate Institute. So welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio, Lee.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, the pleasure is mine. I am so very much looking forward to this conversation. So let me first ask, is there anything I missed in your introduction or anything that needs correcting?
No, I think that pretty much sums me up. No, yeah.
Okay, awesome.
Just like anybody, there's a long history behind who the person is, but those are pretty good key points there. Yep.
Okay, awesome. So I wanted to first congratulate you on your book. I began exploring lucid dreaming probably about 25 years ago. I read the LaBerge books. I still have a paperback copy of his Lucid Dreaming, which my understanding is that is now a rarity.
Oh,
at least that's where I read somewhere recently. But it all kind of fell to the wayside for me. But as I explained to you in private conversation, I had done a little bit of research on Tibetan dream yoga. That also kind of fell to the wayside. So your book kind of reawakened my interest in lucid dreaming. So I'm very grateful for that. And I think it's a very accessible book too. So I just wanted to compliment you on that.
Oh, thanks.
It's worth reading, and I hope people go out and buy the book. Let me ask you kind of a 2-point question here. One is, I think most people are kind of familiar with lucid dreaming, but I want to know how you define lucid dreaming and what led you to begin investigating all of this.
Yeah, so lucid dreaming to me is essentially having some form of awareness, or at least perceived idea that you have awareness in a dream state. So you could be having a normal dream, let's say, and then suddenly you see something out of the ordinary and you go, wow, I'm dreaming. Or you could not actually fall asleep, let's say. You have conscious awareness all the way through, and then you're in a dream state and you're aware that you're actually dreaming. So a lot of people kind of segregate that idea of having awareness in a dream state into multiple categories, like out-of-body experiences, and they call it astral projection, things like that. What I do is I kind of put it all into one thing. Like if you're having a out-of-body experience, you have some form of awareness that you're in a dream state and that you're out of your body. So in that sense, I call that lucid dreaming as well. And the same thing with this really hard to find thing that people call astral projection. I include that into lucid dreaming as well, so that there's like really no confusion as to what is going on. You have some type of awareness. So that's what I define it as. And I spent a lot of time to really kind of get that definition set for myself to say, okay, I can't really define all these other experiences that people have. And there's so much debate online about, and through books that you can read about, like what an out-of-body experience is, what an astral projection is, how is that different from lucid dreaming or each other or whatever. So, to make it simple, I just put it all into one thing. And in my book, I do discuss like these different experiences that I've had that are what I would classify as out-of-body experiences or astral projection. But again, I call it lucid dreaming. and kind of that sums it up. But really, I got interested in lucid dreaming because I had lucid dreams as a kid, and I didn't really understand or have anybody to relate to really with these experiences that I was having. So, like anything that's different than, say, the average person, that you have, a unique ability, you could call it, or something like that, it tends to stick out in your in your consciousness. So if I was like really good at running marathons, which I'm not, or something like that, maybe people would support me to be Olympian or something like that, And so there's not a lot of support for dream enthusiasts, but it's definitely sticks out there in the people that have those experiences. So that was the inspiration to say, oh, what is this? I would talk to friends and family about my experiences, and for the, most part, they didn't understand what I was even talking about. And so that made me really interested in it. I'm not getting the answers that I want from people that I identify as having knowledge, and so I took it upon myself to really dive deep into it. And then throughout my life, I've done a lot of what you have. I've kind of put it on the wayside, put it to the side of me and continued on with normal life. I was in the military for 14 years, and so that's not exactly a great environment for dream induction, and all that, and exploring those topics. So I did try my hardest at times to kind of push my dreams and this whole spiritual, exploration, or metaphysical exploration, or even philosophical exploration aside, and try to continue forward with a normal job. And but every time I did that, I would notice that this almost energy would pop up, into my life, and dreams would become very present and very active, and say, hey, like, hey, we're still here,
Mhm.
and kind of shock me. So, and also kind of like a feeling of not being fulfilled, would pop up too. It's like I'm kind of putting this special thing, this gift, I think, in a way, aside, trying to be normal, when really, like, I maybe should embrace my strangeness, my abnormal things, and really kind of figure and explore that. So it kind of, it brought me back to exploring these topics, and it changed my life. Like, it changed my career path and my goals in life, and really dreams kind of encompassed everything eventually. They kind of took over everything for me. So yeah, it's kind of where it brought me to here, I guess.
Okay, great. I'm just curious. I have to ask this question. What branch of the military were you in?
Oh, I was in the Navy, which is, it's important too, because there's a lot of symbols and
Mhm.
references to the Navy that are dreamlike, and sailors and stuff can be superstitious and all that. So,
Right.
um, and I was in Idaho when I joined the Navy, so it's kind of bizarre that a landlocked person would really have a desire to join the Navy, of all
Yeah.
things. And I wanted to fly airplanes,
Okay.
and that was primarily the reason that I joined the Navy, is because they have a lot of aircraft, and it was an easy way to do that. And and I look back to why I really wanted to fly, and I kind of actually attribute that to dream
Mm.
experiences. The ability, the freedom of feeling that loss of gravity, that people feel in a lucid dream state, that they can experience, and the freedom that you feel from that, like the this loss, and just float, like, it's like being a cloud almost,
Mm.
and so when I experienced that in waking life too, I realized, I really like that, but I didn't really understand why I liked that, and I still really don't understand it fully, but I realized that it's more related to my dream experiences than I really ever thought before.
Mm.
And so, in a long way of saying, I would say that dreams inspired me to actually join the military. I just didn't realize that. So,
Right, right. Well, isn't one way to interpret the ocean symbolically is as like the depths of the unconscious?
right, yeah. Yeah, I mean, sailors are often terrified of the ocean,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
And they also name their boats, feminine
Hmm.
things, and they and it's a barrier. It keeps them out of the water. And it's so
Right.
strange that like a group of people that are terrified of getting in the water for the most part would want to be on the water,
Right.
close
Right.
but far away.
Yeah.
And so there's definitely some relationship to that in my life too, just being scared of like what's in the water, what's underneath. I was always terrified of sharks. And one of the on the day that I was going to leave to the Navy, we actually watched a movie that was about, it was a real life experience that sailors went through. Essentially, their ship got sunk by a submarine, and then they were left out in the ocean and eaten by sharks.
Wow.
And it was absolutely terrifying. And I was like, whoa, what is going on here? And my mom's like, do you want us to change the channel? And I was like, no, it's fine. But it's like, oh, why did that movie get played, at that right time when I was joining? Like, it
Right.
was just some random show on TV. And then this relationship to sharks and the relationship to the unknown underneath the water and stuff. I'm really
Mhm.
in this symbolism as you
Yeah,
are.
for sure.
So,
Yeah.
um, you know,
Yeah, it's kind of making me think that, that would actually, I don't know if anyone's ever done this, but that would be a fascinating study to look at the symbolism of sailing and, the Navy and whatnot. Cause I'm thinking of, the old maps, where you have the oceans, the
yeah,
sea monsters coming up and
yeah.
everything. It's like, yeah, that's a very highly charged symbolic language right there.
Yes, yeah. And the Navy is full of ritual and
Hmm.
symbols,
Yeah.
their rank structure, as well as like they essentially, every single ship, even in modern day, takes time, like an entire day, to have a ritual out in the middle of the ocean when they cross the
Mm.
line. And it's very expensive to do something like that. And it's also, it's vulnerable. You're vulnerable when you do that and things like that. It's not very military like to do something like that,
Mm.
but every single ship does it. They still honor
Wow.
the ocean and the
Wow.
gods of the ocean.
Yeah.
There's like Poseidon and all that stuff. So
Wow.
most people don't know that, but they do. So
Yeah. Let me ask, why lucid dream?
yeah, well, that's a great question. Why do I have these experiences and some other people don't? Or why are some people pulled to have these,
Hmm.
desires to have these experiences and some people don't? Like, my mom asked me the same thing. She's like, well, why would somebody want to have this experience? My mom's known me all my life, and it's kind of interesting. Like I gave her my book and she's like, what is lucid dreaming? It's like, Mom, do you know who I am? Like, this is my like life's work.
Mhm.
And she's like, well, why would somebody want to have this experience? And it's like, well, why not? Like, of course, but it's an interesting thing. I don't really understand what pulls some people's desires to do things and other people don't. And it's also an interesting thing to explore in any situation. And I find myself asking that question more and more, even things I'm interested today. So like I'm interested in flight simulators. So it's like, well, why am I so interested in this? Why am I doing this? And so it's an interesting way of seeing things versus like most people identify things they're interested in. They say, oh, I'm doing this because I like it.
Mhm.
They're like, it's fun, right? And that's kind of like a cop out. It's like, oh, it's fun. That's why I'm
Mhm.
doing it. Well,
Mhm.
why is it fun to you? Well, and then you keep asking that question and you start realizing that these things are a lot more complicated than you really initially thought. And even in my first chapter of my book, the question is asked like, why do you want to have this experience? And really, like, the question is asked in hopes that you don't have an answer. Because it's kind of like isn't it, I think it's Socratic method, right? You keep asking questions until you get pissed off, essentially they kill you, right? So it's kind of the same thing. It's like, keep asking yourself this question of why, and it will lead you in a way that you never really expected. And that was kind of my goal with that question, is because it's really complicated why people want to have these experiences. And oddly enough, it becomes unconscious at a point. You really don't know why you're doing this. Something is driving you to do this thing. Anything in your life essentially is unconscious at some point, and you're like, I don't know why I'm doing this, but it seems really important, and I hopefully am doing the best job I can to engage with it the way that I should, right?
Okay.
So, or I desire, I guess. So for me, why am I so attracted to lucid dreaming? Well, I would say I attribute lucid dreaming and those experiences to a very spiritual experience and path. And it's to know myself, right? In a way that I possibly couldn't understand fully externally, I think. I'm an introvert, so I find meaning from internal things versus external things. And so a desire to go into myself and really explore those topics is very progressive for me. It makes me understand myself better. It makes me understand the world, the external world better, even by understanding complexity of how really complex things are and how wild things can get, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and that what you just said, there's so much there that I kind of want to address. I think that the place I'll start is with this kind of self-examination. And that's one of the reasons why I pay attention to my dreams. I have found it incredibly helpful going through my life. Yet there seems to be, and I don't quite understand why this is the case, but there seems to be this, at least from our culture, this I don't think applies to all cultures, but this belittling of dreams,
Mm.
that they are really just, garbage in, garbage out, and they don't have much to tell us. But yet, our culture and all cultures, even just looking at Western culture, dreams have always been very important. We look at the biblical text, especially, the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament. Jacob has this dream at Bethel of the angels going up and down the ladder, and Joseph is interpreting dreams for the Pharaoh. Am I stereotyping our culture? Do you think that people don't take dreams seriously? I'll just start there.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think absolutely people discredit their dreams as a useful tool that they can use during the day. And I think our culture, the Western culture has infected the entire world with modernism, and essentially modernism and symbolic understanding and knowledge through symbols is complete opposition of each other. So the you can be scientific about those things, but you really don't get to the meat of the material if you're analyzing everything in through the scientific method. You're quantifying things, right? And some things really aren't meant to really be quantified because they lose their use. Say you have I use the conversation analogy. If I'm having a conversation with you and I'm sitting there writing down how many words you said, like ums or thes or whatever, I'm really being completely disrespectful to the relationship that you and I are trying to build with each other. And so, if you're doing that with your dreams, you're kind of disrespecting the conversation that you're trying to have with yourself or, with your dreams. And so it's not really progressive in the dream space to be of a analytical mind, like to be sitting there and saying, dissecting everything and putting it in little boxes, so you can make sense of it. It's sometimes, it would be more beneficial to have a conversation and to learn that way. And people generally, I think, don't really understand the concept of symbols and how dream symbols, what they really represent. And a good example, I think, of this is, again, the conversation you and I are having. Like, you're a you're a human being, I see you in such a way based on our previous conversation or emails, things like that. So I have this idea of who you really are, at least an idea of who you are to me. And you represent the symbol of Nick, right? But I don't really know Nick. Like, I don't know Nick from childhood, every second of his life, all the way up to being who you are today, right? But I have a little background. So my mind generates like a symbol of who you are, and I can interact with that and I can communicate with that, but that only goes so far. The real knowledge that I'm going to get is in having a conversation with you, right? But the symbol is good enough that you and I can have a conversation now, right? It's like the conversation starter in a way, right? And so dream symbols are the same way. They represent things that are much more complex than really we can ever get to, but they're conversation starters. They're the bridge so you can actually communicate to, you could call it the unconscious, right? Or subconscious and so on. So that's kind of what dreams are doing. But if you told somebody, that if they're a scientist, you're like, oh, symbols are conversation starters, they'd be like, what does that even mean? Like you can't really quantify that very well. So I think the very physical realness of reality and studying that and exploring the usefulness of the things in that kind of are in opposition of this other way of learning, this other way of having knowledge. And researchers have attributed that to like left brain, right brain dominance in cultures, right? And we're very right brain dominant culture as well as the majority of the world today, because our goal is to maximize the efficiency that we have while we're awake and demonize anything that is anything that we're asleep. The negative outcome of that is creativity and self-expression kind of goes out the window, over time. And then the culture, the effectiveness of the material, right, production eventually goes down. Even the military understands this because they try to encourage people to be creative, especially like strategics and stuff like that, right? Because if you just do the standard strategy each time, then your opponent is going to learn your strategy and you're no longer effective, right? Same thing with business and marketing and so on. So, you know, it's not really effective to be dominant in one side or the other. But I think that the reason that we're so much demonizing dreams and the randomness of dreams and all this and saying it's just noise is because people don't really see, our culture doesn't really see the utility in dream experiences while you're awake. And I think that's attributed based on what our culture really, you know, sees as important, and really it's a negative because they're hurting themselves. You're shooting your own foot in a way. It just takes a long time for that to really come to fruition, and coffee's a good example, right? I was drinking a coffee before, and coffee keeps you awake, right? And it's one of the number one um, drugs that we use today, right? It's a supplement, it's a drug, and people abuse the crap out of it, and I do, and pretty much everybody I know does, and it affects your sleep. It keeps you awake. It's in opposition of it. Most of the drugs that we use today that are acceptable are actually in opposition to have dreams, right?
Mm.
Because they keep you awake, they keep you active. So
Yeah, I find it kind of ironic in a sense because if you examine our world, our waking world, we are surrounded by symbols. And I don't know how often people actually recognize that the power of, because they do act on a very unconscious level.
mhm.
And it's like every corporate logo is a
Yes,
symbol.
absolutely.
So in a sense, it's like, we have our, I don't know how I want to say that, we have our dream symbols, and this gets to a very old idea of the question of our dreams and sort of other realities, because it does seem like we are in a dream reality now, just with all of these symbols surrounding us. We just kind of fool ourselves into thinking that we're actually awake.
Yeah, there's, there's a lot to be said there. For one, like I gave the listeners and you like an example of a symbol, like you actually are a symbol to
Yeah.
me. And so is everything that you ever experienced. Like a lot of people would not agree with that, but it's like, well, point to something that doesn't represent something else, like
Hmm.
a tree represents something, but if I really examine what the tree is, there's a lot more going on there than just the visual image that I see of a tree. And also like all my memories and associations with that tree and, in my family and so on, right? And, my genes and you could say to my relationship. my past memories as through genetics, right? Dealing with the tree. So it's like there's a lot more going on with the tree than what I see. So I use the tree as a solid object, the thing that I can know, but it's a symbol. It's much more in depth than that. And you can apply that to everything that you experience in life, even like words, even thoughts in a sense are kind of, they represent much more deeper things that have history and so on. So the world that we live in is symbolic. It absolutely is. So, and symbols absolutely have meaning to them. And to deny that is kind of, I think that's a logical error in thinking. And also, like, your question about modernism kind of looking at dreams as wasteful information. It's like, okay, well, if we say that, then we can say the same thing about waking reality. Dreams are symbolic experiences, right? That are essentially simulated in your head, right? And so waking reality is exactly the same thing. It's I'm taking in information through my senses and I am putting that all in my mind and I'm hallucinating my experience. It may be more real, quote unquote, than a dream experience because it's a physical experience that you and I share together, but it's still symbolic and it's still error. It's full of errors. So what I'm hallucinating isn't the same thing you're hallucinating. Like, and we really can't determine how vastly different those things are either. It's like, tell me what the smell of a rose is or the color red. Like, you can't, it's impossible. But we look at red, look at the red rose and we go, oh, that's a red rose, and it smells like a rose. But like, how do I know that your smell is the same as me or the color is the same? I have no way of knowing that, I just assume, right? So it's, the waking world is a lot more like a dream experience than we really think. And it takes a lot of energy from the mind to create this hallucination of the waking world, right? But it also does the same thing with dreams. It takes a credible amount of information and work and energy in order to create this dialogue while you're asleep. You're hallucinating these experiences too. It's in it's so complex. And some of these dreams, you have repeating dreams. It's like the amount of energy that the mind took in order to create that story for you is outrageous. No computer system today could do anything remotely close to that. So it's like, I think people that think that dreams are just random noise are, they're denying the facts, really. And yeah, I don't it's I don't know how they came to that conclusion, really. If they really cared and paid attention to the evidence, the studies, anything remotely close to that, they would realize pretty quickly that this idea that dreams are just random noise it's beyond my understanding how they even got to that conclusion. So
Yeah. And I think that often people, what I find is that they claim that they don't dream,
yeah,
whereas we know that everyone dreams. They
right,
just may not remember their dreams.
yeah,
And when they do remember the dreams, I think quite often the response is, well, that was weird.
yeah, yeah.
When you were speaking, it reminded me of this experiment I did. I was probably in my late 20s, and this is when I was really kind of up to my eyebrows reading Carl Jung. And I had this thought of what would it be like if I interpreted my quote unquote waking life as a dream? What
Mm,
if I walked through almost like what if I experienced my everyday reality as a kind of lucid dream?
yeah.
And I had to stop. I could only do that. I think that lasted about a month, and I had to stop because it was just too much. And I thought,
Right.
okay, madness is just around the corner.
Yes.
Um, but I wonder, do you think that we might be missing something by not engaging in the world and our waking life? Because I think that, you defined a lucid dream as, correct me if I'm misremembering, but it's an awareness in a dream. But you also note, I know in your book, that one of the best ways to start lucid dreaming is to be aware in your life.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Like most techniques associated with tools to get you to have lucid dreams are essentially awareness training while you're awake.
Mm.
And I started realizing that, like most people, they just have, they just have names and they go, well, this works, like a reality check. People look at their hands, they're like, oh, I'm doing a reality check. I do that multiple times a day. That's what it is, but they don't really see, well, why is this so effective, and why do all these other reality checks that are so different than looking at my hands, why do they work too? Well, and then why does meditation work, or being present and aware, why does that work, and like Buddhism and stuff like that, and Tibetan dream yoga? It's like, well, why do all these work? Well, essentially what you're doing is you're being more aware while you're awake, and you're saying, I really care about these experiences, I want to have those more. And it's not like our brains are dumb, they're going to go, it's going to be like, okay, Lee's really interested in having these experiences and he's doing all these awareness training techniques, so I will engage with them, right? There's a dialogue open. It's like having a relationship with a wife or a husband or significant other. It's like, if you're not talking at all, then why would you have a conversation? Your relationship will eventually just deteriorate into nothing. But if you say, hey, I'm really interested in the things you're interested in, right? And I'm also interested in talking to you about those things, then dialogue opens and now you have a relationship. So the same thing happens with their minds. And what you said about engaging the world as if it's a dream, I think that is what myth is, right? Mythology is a way for humans in the past, and it's kind of died, but in the past, a way to engage with the world as if it's dreamlike, because they realize that waking reality is a lot more like a dream than what we think it is today. And I've done that too. It's like I kind of mentioned that. I think, like, why am I interested in the things that I'm interested in? Why am I looking at the things that I'm looking at? Why is that? If I walk through a park, and I see a tree and I'm like, well, why suddenly out of all the trees does this one stand out? What does that mean to me? And it's kind of like taking a passenger seat, in the ride of life. You're like, okay, maybe the experience that I'm having isn't my ego essentially directing me to these things, because I seem to not really understand why I'm interested in things, right? And I think that's, for the most part, for people, they have these passions throughout their entire life and they really get to the end and they're like, I don't know why I did that. If you flip it around and say, well, I really don't know why I'm doing these things and I want to know why. I want to figure this out. Well, if you take a back seat or a passenger seat to this experience, you start realizing that the world in a way is talking back to you. We could say, in psychological terms, it's like, okay, you're hallucinating the world inside your mind, right? And all the senses are coming in, you're having this experience. Well, the mind would be absolutely capable of changing slight things in order to express itself to you, just like a dream does, right? So a dream, you could have a dream that's a normal experience. I have them all the time where it's like, I'm just doing stuff that I may have done throughout the day. Well, sometimes there's little differences in those experiences too. Something will pop out and you're like, well, that didn't happen, in my waking life. That's weird. And the weirdness that we express as weird is actually the key elements that the dream content is trying to express to you to pay attention to. It's just like walking through the park and saying, oh, I'm suddenly interested in this tree. It's like, oh, maybe there's some meaning to that. Maybe the problem is, though, is that most of us have lost the ability to communicate through symbolism, which is the language of the unconscious. So if we don't know the language because it's forgotten, then we can't communicate easily. So, those symbols are actually ways for, and in hopes that the unconscious will connect to us in some way and that we can engage with it again. So I kind of, and then when dreams get really powerful, they get really, there's a lot of emotion in it, either fear, love, hate, whatever. You can kind of, it's like a wake up call, it's like if a family member was really pissed off at you and screaming at you, you probably would say something is wrong. I need to talk to this person or do something so I don't continue to piss them off. And so like that emotional engagement that the dream content is expressing to you is trying to tell you like there's something really important here. You need to pay attention. Most of us though, like we don't really like to engage with some of those emotions like fear, right? Then we're like, I never want to go to bed again because that was absolutely terrifying and I don't know what the hell that was, right? And so it kind of scares us away. But I think really what is happening is it's almost like enticing you to engage with it. It says like, hey, there's something really important here. I'm trying to tell you, but you're not listening. So let me amp this up a little bit more so you can really get the message. So I think engaging the world like that definitely starts breaking apart the solidness of reality. You start seeing it for what it really is. And in your experiment, the mind is kind of playing a game with you. It's like, oh, you you want to see how deep this rabbit hole gets. We'll start showing you some stuff. You're like, whoa, like this is too much, man. Like it's like, yeah, exactly. You don't want to know what is really happening here, maybe.
Yeah.
Or you're
Yeah.
not ready for it.
Yeah. I remember when I was going through this experiment that I was living in Denver at the time. And I remember I was in my living room and I had like the double door. There was like a little patio. I was on the first floor and I could just see right onto the sidewalk in the street. And I look out and there's like this Buddhist monk just walking by. And I was like, okay, so what would that mean to me symbolically at this time? And I love this notion that you're presenting of this sort of conversation, because I don't know that symbolism is such a complex thing. And I think that we often, and I think this is the problem with like dream dictionaries,
Mm.
where it's this idea that, oh, I had this, this symbol of this, Buddhist monk. So I'm going to look it up in this book and see exactly what this means.
Oh.
But the symbols can change based on our experiences of these things. And so I think it is your point of being engaged in this conversation with them is incredibly important. Maybe this is a loaded question or a huge question, but I'm going to go ahead and ask you anyway. Is this engagement with the symbols, both in dreams and especially in our waking life, is that synchronicity? Is that where synchronicity, the idea of synchronicity, comes into play?
Yeah, so Jung was all about the synchronicities and synchronistic events. And so I really tried to understand that. I was like, what is synchronicity? Like, do I really believe in that? Like the world
Yeah.
kind of
What
aligning up to,
what is a synchronicity?
right. Yeah, so I mean, that's I'll define it for myself, I guess. Seemingly random events occurring in such a way that it seems almost predestined or it lines up perfectly to that's a horrible definition, but it lines up perfectly to other events. Like it's almost undeniably perfect experience. It's like, wow, I can't believe that just happened. Like there's no way I could calculate the possibility of that happening. And so at the time I was really exploring that and being like, well, what is that? And I had such synchronistic events happen to me that it was, and a friend that it was absolutely undeniable that those events can happen. So, but I won't go into long detail about the story, but people can decide on their own. Essentially, I think that's the important part, is if they think synchronistic events happen or not. And the really interesting thing that happened to me is that once I was opening myself up to possibly having those experiences, I'll be like, okay, I'm gonna let a little of this go and just have a fun time and see what happens. And then it started happening and I was like, okay. And I kind of actually took a break too because it became so bizarre and weird. I didn't know what to do with it. And I was like, this is just too much for me. I got a life I gotta live. But You could again talk about it in psychological terms. Like again, we hallucinate the world inside our mind based on modern science, right? And so we don't really know how vastly different my experience is from yours. And so the world that I'm hallucinating, the dream, or not the dream, the unconscious could change and modify in such a way that things line up perfectly, and I'm experiencing something that maybe you're not experiencing, but it's so perfectly aligned in my psyche that it feels like it's the world talking back to me, the greater world. I tend to personally, there's no I don't know if there's evidence to support it. Maybe there is, but in my own personal experience, I'd say that that isn't accurate. That the world actually, the experience that we're having is actually much more dreamlike. What, like we said before, in that the unconscious, what we call the unconscious, is a lot more in control of this experience than as a greater experience than we'd like to think. That I'd like to think. So I do think that synchronicities do exist. But then the question comes up, okay, so say that you had this seemingly random event and it was perfectly timed up, like I don't really have a good example, but let's just say, something happened that was perfect, it was a synchronistic event. And then you go, well, what took, what had to be in place for this event to happen perfectly as it is? Well, then you think about your past. You're like, every moment, every second that brought me up to that point, all the red lights that I was pissed off at, waiting for the next car to move or whatever. I'm like, I gotta get home right now. Put the red lights in front of me. That red light, if it was a second or even a moment earlier, green light, the event wouldn't happen. All the way to the start of this whole thing, you call it the big bang if you want, right? All the way to that point, all those events had to line up exactly perfect for that moment to happen. If you apply modern science to it, right? That's just how it would have to happen. There's other options, it's like maybe the world, maybe time doesn't exist and everything's more malleable than we really even remotely think of it, and that events just can happen, without any previous billiard ball experience, to get you to the where you are to that moment. But so either way, I think you're dealt a hand that's like really confusing at that point. And so to me, those big questions, again, it kind of goes back to modernity and like trying to prove things and put them in boxes and say, okay, this is a synchronistic event, but that other thing wasn't, and trying to really just tally up things. It's contrary to what's important. The importance is that these experiences happen regardless if like so-called synchronistic or not. You experience them as that. What does that mean? And really going back to trying to have that conversation again and again, we have to kind of retrain ourselves to say, hey, stop trying to prove everything. Stop trying to put everything in a little box. Have a conversation, like you did with the Buddhist monk. You're like, what does that mean to me, right? Like a scientist could be like, okay, I had this weird event happen to me. How many seconds did it take to get there? Colors were we wearing? How many times have I seen a Buddhist monk before? All this stuff, you kind of just put that to the wayside. You said, what does this mean to me? Why am I experiencing this thing right now? And I think that's much more important than really trying to prove it or anything like that, because it's not really meaningful. Like the conversations that we have right now may inspire somebody to look at things differently, but I'm not trying to prove anything to those people. That's for them to figure out, and really for them to decide what they think is true, what they don't think is true, so on. I'm not going to convince anybody. So, but once they have those experiences like you maybe had, and I definitely had, it's like beyond a shadow of a doubt to me that those events do occur. I don't understand them, but the important thing for me is to say, well, what's this mean to me? I want to have a dialogue. I want to have a conversation. I'm over the proving thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, I agree with you. I really wouldn't attempt to try to prove synchronicity, but I think the key is in the meaning. And the
Right.
meaning is going to be subjective in many ways. Although I do, though, sometimes think that there are bigger synchronicities
Oh yeah.
that are at play, but it's always going to go back to even like a group, kind of collectively saying, oh, yes, we see this as being synchronous, because
Yeah.
they're all sort of accepting the same premises and, and experiences and whatnot. A couple of questions. I want to get to the unconscious, since you've brought that up several times. But first, I still want to kind of investigate a little bit the symbolism, because you've suggested that our relationship to symbols is currently degraded in our culture. And I agree with that. One of the concerns I have is, the symbolic world is such a rich world. And it is, as you pointed out, the grounding, I think, for our creativity. But it often seems to me that all of this has been colonized by mass media
Right.
and the things. And it's like, if I have to see one more movie that tells the hero's journey,
Yeah. Uh, yeah.
and I'm glad it's there, but it's like, I guess that we can have our own individual interpretations of some of these symbols that we're being presented with.
Right.
I've noticed that, and this used to be the case a lot back in my own personal history, but I used to have a recurring setting in some of my dreams. And it was this old, dilapidated movie theater. And sometimes when I would be in the theater in the dream, there would be movies playing. And my interpretation of that was, these are the archetypes. This
Mm.
is the archetypal imagery. And I would have these dreams of this theater for probably a good 10 or 15 years, probably closer to 10.
Mm.
Yeah, 10. And when I actually figured out what was going on and sort of resolved the issues that the dreams were telling me, the very last dream I had, this theater had been completely refurbished,
Mm.
and they were holding the Academy Awards there.
Oh.
And the host, I remember this. It was Steve Allen and Lily Tomlin. And if you remember, they did a movie together, I think back in the 80s. I think, I forget, All of Me or something, where she gets in his body. So it was like, for me, the union of the masculine
Mm.
and feminine.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
I don't really dream of that. I never dream of that theater again. I still sometimes dream of movie theaters, which I always see as, okay, here, this is something that's archetypal. But I do have images in my dreams of, movies and characters from television and whatnot that I've seen. And I'm just kind of curious. It seems to me in many ways that our capacity or our ability to create our own myths have in some ways been taken away from us,
Mm.
just because of this proliferation of media.
Right.
What do you agree with that? Or
Yeah, no, I agree with it. I don't know if it's intentionally done or not. I'm pretty, I tend to think that I'm more on the side that it was intentionally done to remove the imagination of people to become better consumers, and that the media and marketing has really, the really good media, the really good marketing, right, that really takes people's imaginations away, does a really good job in using pretty, I would call them universal symbols in order to drive people in order to buy their product or do whatever they want them to do. It doesn't necessarily have to be a visual image either. It could be a sound, it could be an emotional response from images, things like that, So marketing is essentially using symbols in order to manipulate people to do what you want them to do, buy a product. I was looking at like the Head and Shoulders logo, which is essentially an Ouroboros. And I never really noticed that. I've used Head and Shoulders for years because of my lovely dandruff problem. But so it's like, oh, I buy this product, I look at the logo, I don't really think much of it, but why did they pick that logo, of all things? And the same thing goes with like NBC, like the peacock with the many feathers and the all-seeing eye, I think ABC, or I forget,
yeah,
I get them mixed up.
CBS. Yeah,
Yeah,
CBS.
CBS.
Yeah.
And it's like, I looked up, why they picked those things, and they're like, oh, they just picked it. That's the explanation. It's like, no, not at all.
Yeah.
These people that create those systems really understand what those symbols mean, I think, even if it's not completely in their awareness, it could be unconscious again. And they chose those images to represent what they're essentially are doing. And so the peacock, is associated with like alchemy too, often, and then obviously the eye is a pretty popular image for, people that are conspiracy theorists and stuff like that. But it's definitely an alchemical image as well, and Mason image. So, and it's all over the place in America too. So, and structures even in America, architectural structures such as like the Capitol buildings and stuff like that, they have a round top and they have a square bottom, and that was intentionally done, to symbolize heaven and earth united together. And most people don't really think of these things, right? They see something and they go, oh, it's pretty, it's cool, whatever. But they don't really understand why they're getting those emotional responses from that. And people that understand symbols very well, I think they understand that some of these things are universal and they can use them to get to drive things the way they want people to drive. And in turn, they can control their imaginations. They can control their emotional responses, and they can dictate them to be better consumers, workers, less imaginative, so on. And it kind of drives the progress of America and consumerism throughout the world, like those symbols do. So, in the universal symbols, I think every symbol, everything is universal in the sense that that's how we recognize things. It's universal to humans that we see things and we have similar emotional responses to anything essentially. But there's universal symbols for us in based on culture, right? So like we can look at like a KKK guy with a hoodie on or whatever, not a hoodie, but the pointed hat, and we're like, that's obviously a racist dude, And so we've been kind of taught to identify that as what we think it is, and pretty much anybody in the world can see that now and say, oh, okay, we know who that is, So that's universal in a sense that it's cultural based, and universal for humans, but there's other like but I mean all these things have grounding in something else too, like symbols go down, they go down forever. So
Right.
eventually you get to something that really represents. I tend to think that symbols are more than just these things that we call the imagination too. I tend to think that the concept that symbols are alive, that they connect to actual consciousnesses, you could say, I think that's more closer to the truth than just saying, oh, they're just images that we like. And the reason that we have emotional responses to these things is because the consciousnesses are actually affecting us in our physical being, you could call the consciousness as your unconscious too. It resides in that area that we can't really see into. So
Yeah, it reminds me of before recording this, we spoke briefly about Jung's autobiography, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. And he, or Amelia Jaffe,
yeah.
records
Yeah,
a dream that he had. And it was actually, I think, the dream that really, the way it's presented in the book is what prompted him to think about this collective unconscious, in the sense that the dream, he was going down different levels in this house. And so on one level, there is this sort of personal level. So this is like, the house he grew up in, right? And then he goes down a little bit further, and the imagery is, I don't remember, I think it's something like from the Renaissance or something. And he's like, okay, well, this is more, a few generations back. And so he keeps going down, and as he goes down, he's also going back into time until he gets to this like dirt floor, and there's like bones there. And so I mentioned this because it just reminded me of what you were saying, reminded me of this, is that with our symbols, it works the same way. That, yeah, we have these personal symbols, and then maybe, like our societal symbols, the culture that we're raised in, and then it just kind of keeps going further and further and further. And I wonder, with the use of symbols, be it, on the Head and Shoulders or CBS and the All Seeing Eye and everything like that, it seems like there is, and I don't know if it's intentional or not, but they're tapping into this sort of collective unconscious to motivate people.
Absolutely.
I also know that there's an argument that has been made. There's a documentary, The Century, the Self,
Hmm.
that points out that, modern public relations was created by Edward Bernays, who was the nephew of Sigmund Freud.
Yeah.
And he was actually utilizing Freud's theories, especially this idea that, the id that we want and we desire all the time, to essentially create this modern consumer society. It seems in a way that it's almost this combination of both Freud and Jung. Although I think that Jung might suggest that, I don't think he would deny the Freudian aspects of all of this. I think it's really important, though, to be able to speak this language, and I personally find Jung far better, or far more useful, I should say. And you seem to rely quite a bit on Jung in your book. I don't remember you mentioning Freud. You might have, but I remember Jung quite a bit. And Jung's idea of the unconscious. You also you have a chapter or two on the anima and the animus, and refer to the concept of individuation. So we've been talking about this, and both of us have been kind of throwing these terms around a little bit. And I don't want to be unfair to you, but, and I know this is a huge question, but let's take a step back a little bit. And just for any listener who may not be familiar with Jung and some of these ideas, can we break them down a little bit? Let's start with the unconscious.
Yeah.
Mention the unconscious. What in the world is the unconscious?
Well, we could teach like probably, a few week course on this one.
Yeah.
And really still probably not get to what Jung was really talking about, I don't think. But from my perspective, the unconscious essentially, a good analogy would be looking at the Earth and looking at space. There's a point where the Earth ends and space begins, and so gravity's lost, our atmosphere is lost, and now we're with something else, right? And there's all these other planets and stars and life forms out there, and it goes on forever, right? And essentially that is the unconscious. It's going out your personal space, your personal earth space, and then you're now in the realm of all this other stuff that actually affects you, like the gravitational pulls of the sun obviously affect the earth, because we would just fly off, right? We wouldn't rotate around the sun. And all the other planets and stars affect us, maybe so slightly that we don't really recognize it being affecting us, but it's affected us through, you'd say, our evolution, right? And who we are and how we form and everything like that. And they're all changing too, at the same time. So the unconscious is essentially doing the same thing. And universally, we can look out into the stars and we can see Saturn. We can see its rings and be like, that's Saturn. And throughout history, we've communicated with Saturn. We've used Saturn as an image in a lot of our myths and cultures, and so it affects us, and we can communicate to Saturn even if it supposedly doesn't communicate back to us, right? We can imagine it and stuff. So I think the unconscious is kind of in the same way, that there's something there that's trying to communicate back to us, but in the sense of like what I really think of it as, I think of it as another aspect of yourself too, that you really has a lot more knowledge, I guess, experience in it. It's a collective too. It can be collective in the sense that Jung believed that all humans in a sense were connected to each other in some way and could communicate, essentially wireless networks, right? And that there's a personal unconscious too, where it's personal related to me, where I have, experiences, and it stores it essentially like a local cloud memory almost. And then, and it connects to the larger cloud, which is essentially the collective unconscious. And then it expands even more into this undefined consciousness, which is forever, right? And it concludes everything. But that's kind of, I think, the most simple put way of saying like that's the unconscious. So in symbols, it communicates in a different way, like this we were talking about. It communicates through symbols, and essentially everything's symbols, so it communicates to us. So I don't know if that is that accurate to what you think too, or
Yeah, it's I think, I don't want to get too lost in the weeds, and this can be other kind of conversations in regards to consciousness, because, the unconscious is obviously that which is not conscious. But I think that consciousness is much bigger than our heads.
right.
And I think the unconscious, is part of that. It reminds me of, I'm going to paraphrase. It's Lon Milo Duquette, I think, has a statement. It may be a subtitle of a book of his, that yes, it's all in your head. You just have absolutely no idea how big your head is. Right.
Exactly.
So yeah, so I think that, the unconscious is personal, but also transpersonal.
Right. I would say that it's like what you're conscious of is the things that you know, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what
Right.
you're unconscious of are the things that you don't know, but
Yeah.
it's still conscious. It's not this thing that doesn't have the ability of awareness. It has awareness.
Yeah.
It just you just don't know it. You just don't remember it. Kind of.
Right. Yeah. And well, and one of the reasons I wanted to kind of get you sort of to this point and to explore this conversation a little bit more. And I still want to kind of dig a little bit with Jung, but there seems to be this notion about lucid dreaming, that it is about controlling your
Mm,
dreams.
yeah.
But I get the sense that that's not quite the case. It
No.
seems like there's something else at play.
Well, so I've struggled with this question too, and I struggled with it personally in my life because it's common for people to have lucid dream experiences to say, "Oh, I am the god of this experience. I can do whatever the hell I want to do, and nobody can do anything about it." And I explored that to probably the nth degree, and was like, "Wow, look how powerful I am." But then I started realizing that that wasn't really the case for myself, in the sense that dream characters started kind of responding negatively to my trying to control them. They would answer questions that I'd asked them about, like, who's dreaming? I'd be like, "Hey, are you dreaming right now?" And they'd be like, "Yeah, I'm dreaming." And some of them would say, "No, I'm not." And I'd be like, "Well, if you're dreaming, then what am I?" And they're like, "You're a dream character." And I'd be like, "Well, I'm dreaming you." And they're like, "No, I'm dreaming you." And we get in like arguments over it.
Wow.
And then other dream characters essentially controlling me, and which is something that I would do to them. And it'd be like, "Oh, I've had dream characters remove my memory." They're like,
Hmm.
"Oh, you think you're dreaming me, so what I'll do is I'll just remove your memory." And I'll be like, "What?" And then suddenly I start forgetting things. I'm like, "Oh my God, like what's going on here?" Turns into a nightmare pretty quick. And I got asked, Jungian communities aren't super passionate about lucid dreams because of that. They think it's very dangerous to control the unconscious or even attempt to control it. And so one of my classmates was like, "Do you think you can abuse lucid dreams?" And I was like, "No." And they're like, they laughed at me and they're like, "You don't think that?" And I'm like, "No, I don't think that at all." Because it's putting you in your place. People that think they can actually control their dreams have a logical error in their thinking, because the dream, and this goes back to what I do know about Tibetan dream yoga, right? Is that Tibetan dream yoga doesn't say that lucid dreaming is like special or anything like that. They're actually trying to get past the dream itself into what I remember is called a white dream, where nothing really exists, just the unity the undescribable experience that you can have in that, right? It's not something they can even describe really. And so, you look at that and you go, well, what are they talking about? Well, dream worlds are generated around the character. It's like a movie and you're an actor in this play, right? The script's written, the scenes presented to you, all of the sceneries generated, everything is around you, even the memories that you have about what you're doing. So I mean, example of this, I've had dreams where I'm doing bizarre, weird things, right? And it seems totally normal to me. I can reflect in the dream and be like, oh, of course this makes sense because I have all these memories of me doing all these things that led me to this place. Obviously, this is real. There's no question of the validity to that experience. Well, the memories themselves were fabricated in such a way that I thought that this was normal, right? So if that's possible, then so is the ability to become lucid in a dream can be fabricated. So me thinking, oh, I have awareness in my dream, I can control things, that very well is possibly an illusion by itself. It's actually a false memory provided by the dream to say, now Lee's lucid and he can control stuff, and this is going to be another dream lesson. now now I'm an interactive character in the dream, actually kind of playing the part of the character, not even know I'm playing the part of the character. So there's a lot of debate, I think, in lucid dream research today, at least with the people that I talk to, where they go, yeah, we don't really even know if you can be fully lucid in a dream because there's always I call it the narrator. The narrator is always 3 steps ahead of you, generating the world around you. Good analogy is like a video game. Anywhere you look in a video game, the world is generated by the graphics card. The graphics, computer is generating the world around you, and you're the character running around it. When you're not looking at the direction of the wherever you're facing, the world isn't there. It doesn't exist. But anywhere you look, it's already generated. The story's already generated. You're just a character running around in the story. And if it's a really good advanced computer game, it would always generate content in front of you to direct you to do whatever it wanted you to do. So you would really have no choice in the story. You're always acting out whatever the programmer or the narrator wanted you to do, right? So in a sense, I think dreams are similar in the sense that you can't escape the world that you're in that's generated around you. The memories, the content, the emotional, everything is always generated in front of you. So even the control idea, there's no such thing as abuse because it's always it's allowing you to think that you're abusing it. And the lesson in there is essentially, for me, it's a lesson of control and what really control is. If you think that you're totally in control of your life, even remotely really in control of your life in waking reality, you're going to be sadly mistaken when it suddenly goes out of control. You're like, how did this happen to me? How could this happen when I was in such control? Well, the reality of this situation is you were never in control. You had the illusion of control until it finally broke down and you saw past the veil. So the dream is exactly the same. So anybody that says, oh, I can control your dreams, I'm like, wow, dude, that's cool. But then if if somebody says, oh, these people are just abusing their dream characters and they're abusing their mind, it's like, I don't think you understand how big the mind really is and how powerful the mind is, and what really is happening here. So yeah, I think the control thing is an illusion, essentially. But I encourage people to have lucid dreams, obviously, because I wrote a book about it. But in my my desire is that people will eventually get past that lesson of control, and they'll start releasing their control over to the dream and try to build dialogue. If I'm having a conversation with you and I'm constantly just waiting for my turn to talk, we're not having much of a conversation. I'm actually trying to control the conversation, and it destroys the conversation completely. So by releasing control over to you and saying, okay, what do you have to say now? Then we can have a dialogue. And that's really what I think dreams are trying to get to. And myth is a dialogue. It's not a one-way story.
Yeah. What was it that I think Joseph Campbell said that myth is the public dream and dream is the private myth,
Yeah.
something like that.
I haven't I don't remember that saying, but that's really good. I'm gonna remember
Yeah.
that one.
Yeah, I forget where he said that, but I know he did. So you mentioned the narrator. Do you have any idea who or what this narrator is?
No, I don't. Um, you know, and maybe it's not just one. I mean, I definitely seem to have dreams that are in contradiction of each other,
Mhm.
and I didn't really see dreams as having a positive and negative effect to
Mhm.
them until more recently. I was listening to an interview by, I forget the author's name, but he wrote The Chicken Kabbalah.
Oh yeah, it was
And
Lon Milo Ducat. Yeah.
yeah, he's an interesting dude. But he got asked the questions about dreams too, and he said it was about some negative dreams. And he's like, well, you can have ego-based dreams. And I was like, ego-based dreams? That's not something Jung would say, right? And essentially what he was saying is like, essentially, you know, in occultism and stuff, they believe in a higher self, and pretty much you're trying to progress to the point that you can kind of reunite with that thing.
Mhm.
And that's essentially individualization too, right?
Mhm.
Is the reuniting with the higher self or the self. And so, but ego, you know, can be in the way of that, according to the chicken Kabbalah guy. And you can have ego-based dreams where it's trying to deter you from trying to progress in a direction. And so, you know, anybody that really believes that dreams are all progressive would see this ego-based dream and be like, oh, it's progressive, it's actually trying to help me out. Real, according to this guy, you know, it's turned around and it actually is trying to lead you astray so that you don't continue to progress. And so it's a tricky thing there, you know. And it makes sense that dreams would have a positive side and a negative side to them, because all things do. And if you had a conversation with two mentors, right, you may call them both mentors, but one may try to control you and lead you astray and try to be, you know, with them the whole for the rest of your life, you know, and now you're in a cult. um, but another mentor may try to be like, hey man, you know, here's some ways I did some things, and you may want to follow this to progress to be a better person, or whatever you want to call it. So I don't see why dreams wouldn't do the same thing.
Mhm.
So that's why it's like really important to have dialogue and not like put things in little boxes, you know,
Mhm.
because you need to really fill these things out and say, well, what am I trying to learn here? You know, what's trying to teach me and why? You know,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
where am I going with this? So, I mean, I've there are cases where people have had lucid dreams and they end up murdering people in waking reality because of
Mhm.
their dreams. So
Yeah.
it's not a, you know, it's not a it's definitely not just whatever butterflies and rainbows. You know,
Mhm.
it can, you can have some negative effects from all this stuff. And I've been really challenged by some dreams too. You know,
Mhm.
like I'm like, what was that? Where did that come from? What does that mean? And you know, some really horrific stuff that I never really even thought was inside me. But then, you know, I had these dreams and I'm like, wow, okay, you know, I'm a monster, really, when it comes down to it. And I'm I'm really lucky that I don't express these things sometimes.
Yep.
And I need to really be aware of that, because the more I'm aware of how much of a monster I am, the better human being I can be. And dreams have shown me that. But I think many people may take those experiences and say, I don't want to see that ever again. And you know, some cases I think of PTSD and stuff like that, they're around that realm.
Well, we are all monsters, I think.
Yeah.
Um, and and this is another Jungian concept of the shadow.
Right.
And I know that it's so important to address the shadow from a Jungian perspective for personal growth. I also think that it's important to recognize the shadow collectively. And I think that we have a really bad tendency, especially in this country, to not recognize our own shadow
Oh yeah.
projection.
Oh yeah.
I thought about this. I mean, it's obvious now in terms of how like the political parties,
Oh
are
yeah.
addressing each other. And even with the the last president, my approach was, this is shadow.
Oh yeah.
This
Oh
is all
yeah.
shadow projection. And to say, well, this is all evil, it's like we need to look at our own negative
Yeah.
traits. I think that dream work is a very beneficial way to do shadow work,
Mhm.
to work with the shadow. And I would like to ask you if you could maybe expand upon that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, most people don't really, I mean, a lot of people don't really dive into any of these questions, so maybe I should
Right.
just stop saying most people. uh, for whatever reason, I dive into these questions, and it makes myself mad. But so I'll do that for people. But I went to a school, you said Pacifica, so I'll say Pacifica, and the people there, they study these things. They study shadow, they study archetypes, they study all this stuff, right? But then I'm sitting in class and I'm listening to how they talked about Trump,
Mhm,
and I'm not a supporter of Trump really. I treat him as a human being, I think,
mhm,
and with all human beings, there are definite flaws in all of us, and I really can't judge. I try really hard not to judge other people before I judge myself on those same things. Put myself in their perspective, live their life, and then I say, well, what would I act like? And I'd probably act very closely to how that person acts, in all cases, even murder people and things like that, so it's really hard for me to judge other people. But in the same sense, if you understand the shadow, then you understand projection, right? And so the shadow is essentially like the cumulative dislikes of your being, right? You're like, I don't like how I look, I look fat. And then it goes into this drawer called the shadow, right? And it's essentially a consciousness that exists that is everything that is negative about yourself. That's what Jung kind of would sum it up as, I think. It's a lot more complicated than that, but that's a quick summary. And what we do though is we project onto things, onto people, those aspects of ourselves to kind of play them out. We're again acting as if we're in a play, right? We're playing. And the person will accept that too. So there's like a lock and key mechanism that's associated with this projection. So if we're projecting things that we don't like onto somebody, the person can reject it or they can accept it. And if they accept it, then our hatred towards that person sticks to them, and it seems like we actually have this hate relationship with them, and they actually, unknowing to themselves maybe, accept that hatred, and they're actually acting as like a soundboard for your hatred, so you can actually kind of work it out on that person. Same thing with love and all the other emotions that we feel. So, and people would say, well, how's that possible? Well, it goes back to essentially everything that you've ever experienced is inside your mind, right? And so if you dislike somebody, the only way that you can actually relate to that person is by having those things that you dislike about that person already inside yourself in some aspect. That's the only way that you can relate to even the hatred that you feel towards that person. So if you dislike Trump so much, then it's a great mirror to turn around and say, well, why? What are those things I dislike about him that's actually
mhm.
inside myself? I think that's a much more progressive way than saying, I hate that person. I don't know why, or here's all the reasons I hate them, and just continually doing that, But to each their own, everyone's playing their own game, I guess, with themselves. So that's their game. But, in shadow work in lucid dreams, essentially it gets complicated because Jung never really he never acknowledged really the metaphysical aspects of dreams or reality, and he really kind of discredited the cult aspects of those things too. So, like Rudolf Steiner, he wrote about this thing called the Guardian of the Threshold, and if you read about the Guardian of the Threshold, it's very shadow-like. It's an object that keeps you in the veil, away from the greater reality, and it kind of stops you from entering there until you're ready to face it. And essentially, it's kind of a fearful thing, right? And it's also described very shadow-like too. And so, there's that aspect of it. In dreams, you can I have dredged up, shadow-like stuff with nightmare-like figures in my dream and tried to communicate to them. So an instance of this that's in my book is me interacting with a zombie. And so in the dream, well, a little backstory. I was continually having lucid dream experiences and out of body experiences, which are lucid dreams, in my house. And I was very proud of myself because I would go and attack these dream characters that were nightmarish and beat the hell out of them, right? And I was like, yeah, I'm so cool, I'm powerful. And at the time, I was luckily taking a class on Buddhism from a teacher who's still my friend today. And he's one of the type of people who'll just tell you like straight up if you're kind of messing up. And so I was like really proud of my ability to beat these characters up. And I wanted to tell him, I was like, yeah, I have these cool experiences nobody else does, and I'm special, look at me. So I went up to him, I was like, yeah, like I told him about my experiences, what I was doing, and he's just like, looks at me like I'm crazy. And he's like, well, why would you attack these things? Like they're part of you. Why don't you sit down and have a conversation with them instead? And I was like, what? He just totally blew my mind. So I was like, all right, let's try it. So I knew that I was going to probably have a lucid dream that night. So, or that morning, the next morning, I guess, because I was taking naps and that's when I was having them. And so I had a dream. I got out of my body. I walked down the hall and I turned around, and sure enough, there's this zombie creature walking towards me. And I'm just like, okay, I want to have a conversation with this thing. So I knew it wanted my brains because that's the type of zombie that I always have. And so I bowed my head down to it, and I could feel the crunch of the zombie eating my brains. I was just like, ugh. And I just didn't react, and it stopped. It was complete silence. And I looked up, and the zombie, wasn't doing anything. It was just standing there, and I was like, hey, let's sit down and have a conversation. And it was like, okay. And it sat down. It didn't say anything. It just sat down with me. And I looked at it, and I can't remember correctly if it like turned into me at that moment, but essentially it turned into a copy of me. The zombie design or whatever went away, and it was me. And I was like, oh wow. And I'm like, well, what's bothering you? And it said, I'm unsatisfied. And I'm like, well, what are you unsatisfied about? And it said, I'm unsatisfied. And I was like, okay. And then I look down the hallway and I see another zombie walking up to us, and I'm like, hey, sit down with us. And so it sits down, and it pulled wires out from its stomach, and so did the other one. And then they connected it to each other, like exchanged the wires, and then they merged into each other, and then they merged into me. And I immediately woke up, and I was like, what the hell was that? And I still don't really understand what that was all about, but there's a lot of symbolism in there, like the merging, the Trinity merging together, creating one, things like that, and these other fragmented aspects of myself, coming together. But it also is zombie, it's like very symbolic in the sense that essentially it's an unsatisfied being that has this desire to eat flesh, and it has no like real nutrients or anything from that. It's dead, and it just desires more and more and more. And that's kind of like our culture essentially. And a lot of us feel that way, and I do feel that way in a lot of senses. It's like I'm constantly struggling with the desire for more, to feel something that is unfillable. And I'm just like, I need it, I need it, I need it. And I know it's never going to satisfy me. But I think in a zombie, there's no awareness of what they're doing either. They have no self-reflection. They're just doing these things. So, and zombies are a very powerful symbol even today. We make TV shows about them. Some of the most popular ones have zombies in them. So it's like, okay, these are very powerful symbols. But so that was very shadow-like work, I'd say. And I said that I didn't understand the mechanism behind that, like what happened with these merging and all that. But I can say that when I woke up, I felt changed. Something slightly inside me had changed, and I couldn't put a word on it. And that's kind of like the gnosis, that people find in like ancient texts, is like essentially you know something, you have knowledge of something, but you can't like really define it. And it's beyond kind of this this material definition. And Jung says the same thing. He said that dream, you don't have to sit there and analyze every single dream down to its finest detail, because because you had the dream, that is enough. It's doing what it's supposed to be doing. So, and it comes back to like, that always brings me back to being like, well, what am I doing? Like I'm having lucid dreams. I'm trying to remember my dreams, I'm trying to recall these things. But if I don't do any of that, then it's still doing what it's supposed to be doing, right? And in a sense, yes, but also our drives and desires to do certain things are also part of that story, like our drives and desires are unconscious for the most part. We don't really have conscious awareness of why we're doing things, but we're doing it for a reason. So when you're trying to experience these things, you're trying to engage more with your dreams. That's part of the process. What process that it brings to you, I don't know. I'm still in this process myself. But I can
Yeah.
tell you that I'm so thankful that I've had these experiences, because I can see the world in such a different way than I did before, and I find much more beauty and in full life in waking reality now that I've had these experiences. I feel like the world is so much more alive than it was before.
Yeah, that's amazing.
That's one aspect of shadow work that
Yeah.
I've encountered. Another aspect of shadow work that is really common through people that explore lucid dreams is actually a seemingly very real physical manifestation of the shadow as an object that you actually have to encounter. And that crosses into like the metaphysical aspects of what the cultists essentially are getting to, like the ethosophy. I never say it right, but Rudolf Steiner's work, he's essentially saying like you can really encounter these things. Jung would say you can never actually encounter an archetype. They're always way out there. You encounter the emotional power of those things, but you can never really encounter them.
Yeah.
And I disagree in the sense that cross-culturally, as well as my own personal experience, I've encountered things almost exactly how Rudolf Steiner described these things, as essentially the guardian of the threshold.
Mhm.
And it's not uncommon for people that explore lucid dreams to have those encounters through sleep paralysis
Mm.
and those experiences. And it's something that people should be cognitive of, because the encounter can be very traumatic if you don't know what it is, and also it can be very healing if you approach it, I think, in a different way.
Yeah.
So in my book, I really dive deep into that, my personal encounter, so that people can relate to it, and they can say, if it happens to them, they can say, well, this is what Lee did, maybe maybe I'll be
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, it's you mentioned the sleep paralysis in the hypnagogic state, and I remember in the book you said that they can be a portal, and I think maybe that's kind of what you're getting at, is that the sleep paralysis seems to be some kind, it's in that same spectrum as lucid dreams. Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
I haven't had a lucid dream for like 20 years, but I do frequently have the sleep paralysis experience. I'm trying to get to the point where I can work with them a little bit, because what I always find is just that the fear is what kind of shocks me out of it, because, there's immediately that moment of, oh my God, I can't move. I need out of this.
Right. Yes.
But I think what you wrote in your book is like, well, you can get beyond that. And I think that's really powerful statement, because what that's suggesting is, and I think that is part of the shadow work, is that, if you just breathe for a moment,
Yeah.
you can actually work with what's going on.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah, it's not to say that it's not super uncomfortable and also very traumatic. It can be incredibly horrific for a lot of people. I've had friends that have had sleep paralysis experiences where they're essentially raped, and that's not something that anybody really wants to be told they can work through. And I've also had that happen to me in sleep paralysis, the feeling of that happening. And there's some reasons behind that if you go into like if you go into Hinduism and stuff like that, in qigong and stuff, you can eventually find reasons why somebody may have that feeling. But the main thing I've learned from sleep paralysis is that, it's important to understand what the experience is and that you're having it. And by doing so, then you can kind of take a breath, It it's it can be so scary though, and it's really hard to do that. And that's like an art form, but if you aren't constantly just reacting something, you can kind of step back and say, this is just a dream experience and it'll go away. One thing that I really realize with sleep paralysis is kind of to relax and not try to fight it, because the body's normal mechanisms is trying to put you to sleep. It's trying to make it so that you're actually paralyzed, you can't move, and that you're dreaming and that you're not conscious when that happens. And so it's actually trying to push you into that sleep. And really you're kind of in between, those states. If you take it as an analogy of like a space shuttle leaving the atmosphere, it's very violent, when the space shuttle is, or whatever we use now, not space shuttles, I guess, anymore, but is leaving the atmosphere. You see the movie screens and the people are shaking, like uncontrollably. And then suddenly there's this super release, right? Where gravity doesn't affect them anymore and the atmosphere is not hurting them or anything, And also when they re-enter too, like they hit the veil of the atmosphere and there's just shaking uncontrollably, and then they're in the earth and it's like, oh, okay, it's peaceful now. The same thing happens when we enter sleep paralysis. The vibrations can be so intense that it feels like your soul is essentially being ripped from your body. You can encounter things that are traumatically beating the crap out of you, and so, but if you relax enough and you allow yourself to get pushed through that veil, things will become quiet and calm. Not to say that every time it works, sometimes through experimentation, right? When we're trying to leave the atmosphere, sometimes we don't have the right angle and we're stuck in this cycle of hitting the atmosphere and just getting beat up and then eventually come back down. Same thing happens with sleep paralysis. Sometimes I'm stuck in the in between and I'm just sitting there violently shaking, and I'm like, okay, when's this going to end? Like, this is annoying. But, through practice, I think, in learning how to deal with that, we can eventually use it as a technique to actually have these very interesting healing experiences. Sleep paralysis has been healing to me too.
Has it?
Okay. Yeah. Just like you said, working through that fear, working through that control, because people that resist sleep paralysis essentially don't want to have the experience happen to them anymore. So they're trying to resist it and trying to control it so that they don't have that. But oddly enough, once you release control 9 out of 10 times, you're fine. A good example in a movie is like Contact, right? They build the dome, the little circle thing, right, as the aliens told them, and they put a chair in there though, and they put a chair in there for her safety, right? They wanted to control the experience. They didn't think that the aliens knew enough, right? They're like, we're gonna put this. The aliens didn't know who we were, so we're gonna put this chair in there to really help her out. And then she's in there and she's shaking uncontrollably, right? Just like, it's like horrible. And she finally is like, she sees her necklace floating up, right? And then she's like, oh, and she gets out of there and the chair breaks off, hits the wall, and she's like free floating in space and everything's perfectly fine. It's kind of the same thing. Once we release this mechanism of control, things actually can relax and finally process through us,
Yeah, I find that the sleep paralysis experience, I mean, my experience of it has been a little bit different from what I can remember from the last time I had any kind of lucid dream, because when I became aware that I was dreaming within a dream, it still had a dream-like quality to it. Whereas when I have the sleep paralysis, it feels real.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like I'm in a dream. It
Right.
feels like I am in my ordinary waking reality.
Oh yeah. Well, that's where like out of body experiences come about, right? Where the experience seems more real even than reality. it's so hyper realistic that you cannot determine the difference between being asleep and being awake. So I've had sleep paralysis where I can't move, right? The typical paralysis, and I see things or whatever, and I'm pretty sure that I'm awake,
Mm.
and obviously I don't have weird random ghosts walking through my house or creepy alien looking things, right? So my wife didn't see those things, but I think it's real, and my wife doesn't see me like sitting there vibrating in bed, like, like a train's going by or something.
Right.
So I'm in that in between state.
Yeah.
Now, if you relax enough, and even sometimes, after a while, I stopped getting sleep paralysis. I would just kind of lay in my bed long enough, and suddenly I'm like, okay, like, am I asleep? I don't know. And so I get up out of my bed and I start doing jumping jacks in hopes that I don't wake my wife up and look like a crazy person, and I start doing jumping jacks and suddenly I'm floating in the air,
Mm.
and I'm like, okay, I'm dreaming, but I literally have no idea that I'm dreaming. Like it's so realistic. I cannot tell the difference. I mean, going to the bathroom and flipping my light switch on and off as fast as I possibly can, and it does exactly what it's supposed to do. And then something happens, and I realize I'm actually still in a dream. Some other error happens. I'm like, oh my gosh, I've been dreaming this whole time. I used to think that I was sleepwalking through my apartment that I was renting. I had roommates, and I talked to them in my dreams, but I thought I was sleepwalking, and I'd be like, and I talk really slow. I can't like make any sense. And they're just like, what are you talking about? Like, and then I'd wake up and I'd go talk to them. I'd be like, hey, sorry about that weird conversation we had. And they're like, what are you talking about? Like, I was like, what? And they're like, you didn't talk to me, I'm like, oh, I was streaming. That was weird. But it seems so real, and the people act exactly how they're supposed to act. Everything's so realistic. You just like, I can't tell the difference. Is very telling of waking reality too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember you saying something about shamanism,
Mhm.
and relationship to dreams and spirituality and stuff too, and that kind of comes in contact with sleep paralysis a lot, as well as like experiences people have in there. So we can talk about that if you'd like.
Yeah, because one of the questions I originally had for you, and I decided I wasn't going to ask it, but well, and I decided not to ask it because I kind of answered my own question.
Oh, okay.
But I'll say this as best as I can. So the original question was, can you have a lucid dream when you're awake? And what prompted that question was an experience I had. I took a weekend workshop with Michael Harner, who did the Way of the Shaman. And this was in downtown San Francisco. It was in a hotel, and there were, I don't remember, about 100 of us or so. And it was over a weekend. Not the best place to learn how to do a shamanic journey, right? And so we're in like a conference, not even a conference room, but like a ballroom or something. And they actually had the drummers in there. And I had no luck at all the very first day in achieving any kind of sort of shamanic experience. The second day, we were paired up with someone. We actually did several journeys throughout this thing. And so I ended up working with this woman who I had never met before in my life. And we were supposed to do a journey to answer whatever kind of question they may have. And her question that she wanted answered was, am I on the right career path or should I change careers? Something like that. So, everyone lies down and they dim the lights and the drummers start. And at first it was just this sort of daydreamy, kind of nonsensical stuff. That's what I had experienced throughout this, and, annoyance of people sitting in chairs and creaking the chairs. But it was fascinating to me because I was fully, I was aware. I wouldn't say that I was asleep at all, but all of a sudden I had what was almost like a dream experience. It was like I woke up into a dream, if that makes sense. And I was standing in this, like, I was looking down, and there was I saw immediately this horse hoof come down in front of me. And I look up and I'm standing in this field and there are these wild horses running by. And then as soon as I see this, the drumming change, you get the callback is what they
Hmm.
call it. And, you're supposed to follow your track pack and everything. And then, so after this experience, you had to get with the person and share your experience with them to see if you answered their question. And so I met with this woman and I was telling her all the daydreamy stuff. And I could tell just by the look on her face, she was having nothing to do with it. And so I then said, okay. And I should have started with this, and I don't know why I didn't. But I'm like, okay, well, there was this thing at the end. And I explained the horse hoof and seeing the horses. And she just looked at me and she said, thank you. You answered my question. And apparently she had been she worked on rehabilitating wild horses. And she had been thinking of leaving and or pursuing something else. And this was her sign, like, no, you're supposed to work with the horses.
Ah.
And so the experience for me, and I've never been able to achieve that again. And I think part of it is kind of like lucid dreaming. It's something you have to work at, you have to practice. And the more you do it, the better you get at it, perhaps. But it was interesting to me because, like I said, it was almost like waking up into a dream.
Mhm.
And I saw a parallel between that and this lucid dreaming experience of becoming aware within the dream.
Mhm. Yeah. So Jung would talk about his active imagination techniques. So essentially pulling the dream content into waking reality and working with it as though it's like a real, essentially you're creating a tulpa or an imaginary figure that, or friend or whatever, you're bringing dream content out. You're actively working with the imagination, amplifying it to be as real as it possibly can to the point that it starts communicating back to you as a waking hallucination almost, right? And I think that's cool and all, but it's like, well, what's really happening here, And so, what is imagination? What is that? I tend to think that the imagination isn't something that's just in your what we think as just fake, right? It's fake. I tend to use the scientific method and apply it to that, and I say, well, if science is real, right, then everything comes from something else. So the imagination has the result of something as well, and so the content in there has to be something as well. And so how it interacts with, and also like sleep and wakingness and consciousness, right? Being consciously awake and stuff like that is very malleable as well, right? People can have daydreams, they can have hallucinations, waking hallucinations, all these different things. And it's like, well, what's going on there? What I think is that these realms, right? The dream world, if you want to call it, the unconscious realm and the waking realm are very thin. And there's a small barrier keeping this show together, right? And it, like you were saying, we're like one step away from being completely insane, It doesn't take much. It really doesn't. If anybody's ever used like any hallucinogens or entheogens or whatever you want to call them, it takes very little for a person to go from completely stone cold material scientist to being completely unrational, stripping naked and running through the streets, right? So you having that type of experience, I don't think it really takes much. Some people, have a weaker ego, right, than other people, and some of people are Jung had this idea of ego not being really a bad thing, right, that we tend to think today. It was you can have many different kinds of ego, right? You can have a malleable ego, you can have like a really hard ego, and then you can have like a semi permeable ego, right? And in every phase in between. And essentially the ego is what keeps this sense of reality together. So when you start making it so that things can enter the ego, well, it's entering your version of reality to make it something that you typically wouldn't experience. The same thing with the too hard of an ego too. It's like some people don't allow anything from the outside world enter their version of reality. They are very solid, right? But with those people, unfortunately, when something is so massively has such a massive amount of energy behind it, it forces into them, right, their ego, and essentially shatters their complete worldview, and they may fall apart and never be put back together. And they have psychotic breaks, right? But anybody that kind of works through these processes of like drumming, meditation, and all these things, they're essentially making it so their ego is a little bit more malleable so that things can enter into them that typically aren't. In that sense, everybody really is in my eyes, kind of a shaman, right? Some people are gifted to be that way. Some people are trained that way. Shaman is a very loaded term too. It's like I'm a shaman, it's like,
Yeah.
well, now you're just trying to put a label on something, right? And all the training and everything associated with that, it's like, okay, but essentially every human being has magical abilities, right? Of having the imagination enter into their ego and change their worldview, or get information that exists outside of what they know, right? And I would explain your situation very remotely close to the same thing. Essentially, you got the information from somewhere, and it could be unconscious, right? You could have picked it up from
Exactly.
her or whatever. You could explain it away in that sense. It doesn't matter. What does matter
Right.
is you experienced it, right? And
Mm-hmm.
and that's what happened. So, in my eyes, you would be at that moment a shaman, right?
Yeah.
And then now you're not. It's like,
Yeah.
okay. Um, and you were healing the person too,
Mm.
oddly enough. Another way of explaining it is like she somehow actually has the malleable ego, and she used you as a way to
Mm.
give her that information that she really needed or something. And maybe that's why you haven't had it since, or something. I
Yeah.
don't know. It's hard to
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I really based it on that I just haven't been consistent in practicing with it.
But yeah,
But
there's something to be said about that too. It's like
yeah.
what she said something very interesting. She said, at least from what you said about it, is
Mm.
she said, am I supposed to be in this job?
Yeah.
And it's like, what if people turned that around and said, why am I in this job?
Yeah.
What am I learning from this job?
Mm-hmm.
That's why I'm on this journey, like,
Mm.
I can change it, I could change it if I really wanted to, but let me first see what's happening here before I go on to something else, or
Yeah.
to each their own. But I
Yeah.
more and more in my personal life, I found that for whatever reason, I'm asking those questions more instead of saying, I'm in this deadbeat job, I just want to leave, It's like, well, why am I in this deadbeat job? What
Mm-hmm.
led me here and where is it going?
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe there's something here that I'm missing.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think this gets into working with the shadow in many ways. It's like, if you are in a job or something that you hate, it seems like there's a part of you that wants it. And instead of asking, well, how in the heck can I get out of this? Which is a valid question, but to also ask, why am I still here?
Right.
What am I to learn from this? What is it that I'm getting out of this? Because
Right.
maybe there's a part of me that just gets off on being exploited or having a horrible boss or, something
Yeah.
like that.
But it's interesting we use words, like that. If somebody's really having a shitty time in their life, they're like, why is this happening to me?
Yeah.
It's like, why are you using those words? Obviously, deep down inside, we identify some type of external force that's actually acting these things out.
Mm.
And we're part of that. It goes back to like, I think, it's kind of based in the reason of multi lives, reincarnation, things like that, and kind of choosing this life before you experience it. And that's easy to say when you're having a freaking good time. You're like, I'm a millionaire and like life's great. But it's like when you're poor and broke and like everybody around you is dying that you love, it's like, holy shit, this sucks. And it's like, why is this happening to me? And it's really hard to turn around and say, what am I to learn from this experience? Like, this is, if this is planned, then this experience sucks, but like, really, how can I embrace that and like move on into my further growth? And some people that have done that, we've identified them as being some of the most powerful people on the planet. They're like,
Yeah.
you've had such great suffering, but how did you overcome that? And they're like, I accepted it as my life. I accepted it as something I'm supposed to learn from, and moved on from that. So it's hard to do, easy to say.
Yeah. Well, I think that I like the connection with the shamanic in a number of ways, but in particular, it seems to me, and I don't know, maybe this is, from having, listened and read too much Terrence McKenna when I was younger, but there does seem to be this sort of reawakening to these things. And I think the power of looking at lucid dreaming is that it gets us thinking about the spectrum of consciousness, because like you said, it's not just conscious unconscious, that there are degrees or different kinds of phases to it. And it seems like we've lost the ability in many ways to explore them. And I think it's to our detriment as a species and as individuals. And that's where I personally see the power in promoting and encouraging lucid dreaming, because it allows us to tap into this sort of shamanic aspect that we've kind of lost as a culture, and can help us all heal, and not
Yeah.
just individually but collectively.
Yeah, I wrote my book because I thought that I was given a lot of mentorship from other people. I worked really hard to overcome some of my problems, or at least to identify them and try to work on them. And my goal was to help other people not have to suffer as much, and find maybe a path that would benefit them in creating their own personal myth, and really looking at dreams as something that can inspire them and heal them, and not just something just to throw away when you wake up. And it can influence their waking life and change how they see the waking reality and how they interact with people. It's very, psychedelic in that sense. We today, psychedelics are easier because you can quantify it easier, right? Not so much the experience, you can quantify like the mechanics between taking something, So it's like, ooh, this is a shiny tool that we can use to do this, right? But again, it's kind of a bridge between the dream and the waking world too. It's kind of Jungian, right? In that sense. But dreams are, they're natural, they're always there, and they can really do, I think, even a better job than taking something external and changing your consciousness that way. And I think it more and more, will be, as a culture in the world, will be led back to um, a desire to reconnect with the symbolic meaning of the world. Like things never stay the same very long, and powers, that are in charge, they get to a peak and then they lose their control, right? And eventually it'll wax and wane back to be the other way. So I'd imagine sometime, if humans live long enough, we'll be in a world that's totally different, a completely symbolic world where everything is symbols, and we have that language, and we have no concept of like real rational thought anymore. And then we'll forget this all, like we'll look back in the past and be like, we have no idea the history or anything of these people that used to be here that were this way. And then it'll do the same thing again. And some point there'll be a middle ground, right? And that's kind of where I'm leading in my life, in a microcosm, right? I've gone through a lot of these waxing and wanings myself, and many people do all the time, where it's like I'm an extremist scientist, and now I'm extremist mysticist or whatever, and this keeps going on and on. And it's like, okay, if the pattern exists individually, it exists as a larger group too. So I think that the future is not necessarily good or bad, but it will definitely lead us back to symbolic knowledge. And I think that's where people are getting closer to in this breakdown of fact and things like that. They're looking for something. They're saying, well, nothing's real. They're essentially desiring to go completely the opposite direction where nothing's real, all logic aside, right? But there's definitely a middle ground there, and it's some things are real, maybe one thing's real and the rest is unreal, but essentially, I think it's leading us back to really recognizing consciousness, a supreme consciousness that we're part of, and I call that God. So everyone has different names for that, but that's what I call it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the key, is that there is something beyond all of us, whatever we call it, whether it be God or some transcendent self. And I know some people just like to use the generic, universe or
Right.
creative source of the universe or something like that.
Those are all symbolic terms describing the exact same thing.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And we just get into fights about the clothes it wears.
Right. Again, there's that scientific mindset of trying to put it in the box. It's funny, it's like you have these communities that essentially they're like, we don't put anything in a box, but then you're like, you mention Hebrew symbolism or Christianity symbolism, or even, sometimes Buddhist symbolism, and on, depending on what community you're talking to. And they're like, no. And it's like, you guys are doing the exact same thing that you hate. It's like, it's symbols, man, like they just don't understand symbols.
Yeah.
So I would encourage, that's one thing I really do encourage people: first, read my book, and also after reading the book, to really spend time on trying to understand symbols in your relationship to them, because that will lead you back to total knowledge. I think complete knowledge is in those things. So understanding that language will lead you back to things you possibly could never imagine. I think I'm still impressed daily what symbols have done to me, so, and are doing.
Yes. Well, I would second the statement that people should read your book. And it's available on Amazon and Bookshop too, I think.
Yeah, it's
bookshop.org.
pretty much everywhere. They can go to luciddreambook.com, and that's pretty much it takes you to taileaters.com. So it's easier to learn and remember, luciddreambook.com. And then on like middle of the page, you can buy it through Amazon. You can get a signed copy from me if you'd like. It's a little bit more expensive because I include other things than just the book in there, which I think is really cool and important for people. It's a symbolic medallion that I made for that community, and it's my way of saying thanks for supporting me a little bit too. And then they can go to the publisher and buy it too through Inner Traditions. If people don't have money and they really want to get this content, then I ask them that they email me directly, and I would be glad to hook them up. So I'm not trying to make money off this book. I'm trying to make my money back, essentially, that I put into it, if possible, but that may take me a long time. And but my real passion is to help people learn about this and get the message out that, dreams are really important, and that some people that may have some of these really sometimes horrific, terrifying experiences, they're not alone, and there's other people that can help them, and that they can work through those things and really improve, I think. And it's such a sad state, where people wake up and they just discredit their entire nighttime experience, and it's such deep knowledge that you can learn from it. And so hopefully my work will bring people back to that. So
yeah, and we sleep what, a third of our lives.
yeah.
And
some more than others.
And so much of that is dreaming, and not paying attention is like just disregarding this huge chunk of your life.
Yeah.
So
I mean, there's something said about the people that deny the knowledge that can be in dreams, and that's a journey on themselves, their perspective of reality, their perspective of the imagination, what really imagination means to them. And I think that's really sad. It's a really sad state. I think imagination is much more powerful than we really attribute to it, and that it should be recognized for what it is. Now, I don't know if it's intentionally done or not. That's up for debate, but it seems to be possibly that way. So Real freedom is in the imagination, I think, and how you use it. That's the real freedom. So
Yeah, I like that very much. So, how can we've got the website luciddreambook.com, and I'll include that in the show notes. How else can people find out about you and your work?
well, tailorators.com is probably the best way. So there's free guides on there on how to get lucid, working with sleep paralysis, things like that. There's tons of free information on there. There's information on psychedelic, shamanism, memory, pretty much anything related to consciousness that I personally explored, and then other people have guest posted on there and wrote some really good articles on a very wide range of topics. So they can go there, and there's Facebook groups that you can join through there. There's a Discord group that you can chat with other people. The Discord's not so active, but the Facebook group is pretty active. There's like 700 people in there, and a lot of those people are actually more skilled at lucid dreaming than me, even. So they're actively practicing, and some of them are naturally capable of having lucid dreams every night. So they can answer a lot of your questions if you have it on experiences that you've had and things like that. I'm more interested in like kind of the symbolic nature of dreams and like working with them in that way instead of trying to determine if they're real or not. But there's some people in there that are very interested in determining if dreams are real, quote unquote real or not, and so you can go there and talk to them about that, and they'd be able to definitely open your mind to some different ideas. So that's probably the best way. And then they can contact me through the website, and they can fill out a contact form there, and they can get a hold of me that way. And I respond pretty much daily through that. So yeah, there's plenty of ways to get a hold of me. So
Okay, wonderful. I truly enjoyed this conversation, and thank you again so much for
yeah,
your
thanks, Nick.
time and
Yeah,
for speaking with me. I truly appreciate it.
thank you for having me with you, man.
And that's a wrap on episode 3 of Rebel Spirit Radio. I wanted to offer a correction on something I said when I referenced the 1984 movie All of Me. I said it starred Lily Tomlin and Steve Allen. I have no idea why I said that. It was Steve Martin, not Steve Allen. All apologies to Mr. Martin. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this podcast, please be sure to give it a positive review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or whatever service you use to listen to podcasts. Your reviews really do help. And please consider subscribing. For those viewing on YouTube, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you will be kept in the know regarding upcoming episodes. For the time being, I'll be releasing episodes every other week, with the goal of releasing them every week in the near future. Also, please consider making a one-time donation via PayPal or join as a sustaining donor via Patreon with 3 levels of membership available. Details can be found at patreon.com/Rebel Spirit. Your support makes this podcast possible. I'm Nick Mather, and you've been listening to Rebel Spirit Radio. Until next time, may you be in peace and flourish in all possible ways.